Stratification on a global scale is staggering. When we measure global stratification, people generally divide the world into three categories. The first category represents the most industrialized nations. This is about a third of the geographic world, but it's only 16% of the world's population. The types of countries that fall into this category are the United States, Canada, most of the countries in Western and Northern Europe, Japan, Australia, and others. The industrializing world makes up about a fifth of the geographic area, and again, about 16% of the world's population. This is more of the countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, many of the countries in South America and Central America, such as Costa Rica. The least industrialized nations are about half of the geographic area of the world and about 70% of the world's population. So immediately we see a disparity there. Some countries in Africa, Central America, and Eastern Europe make up this group. So, what is development? Development refers to an expansion of the economic base. But when we talk about development, we're also implying something about the culture and the politics of the region. Historically, when people have talked about development, there's been a presumption that less developed areas were worse or less than other nations. This has been a very problematic thing, and scholars have had to work to overcome that particular perception. Development occurs at an uneven pace. Rates of development vary across time and place, and they tend to follow the general trends of the world market. When the world market is strong, you tend to see more development than when it's weaker. Currently, however, there's a trend towards widening economic disparities. The richer nations are getting richer, and the poorer nations are getting poorer. Within those nations, the richer people are getting richer, and the poorer people are getting poorer. It's also important to keep in mind that development and economic conditions are not synonymous. Being the richest country doesn't necessarily mean you have the best education system or the best healthcare system. Being rich doesn't mean you necessarily take care of your citizenry. One key indicator of development is called the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is a composite measure, meaning that it takes a number of other statistics and weights and combines them to create a single measure of development. Some of the things that go into the Human Development Index are things like life expectancy, educational attainment, literacy, and income. The Human Development Index is maintained by the United Nations. They also maintain some other indices such as the Gender Inequality Index, the Gender Development Index, and the Multidimensional Poverty Index. One of the things social scientists seek to explain are the vast disparities in standards of living across nations. As these images suggest, people live in enormously different conditions even on the same continent. Initial attempts to address the question of disparities in standards of living between nations led us to what's called developmentalist thinking. Developmentalist thinking is largely outdated and outmoded today. In this view, the Western model of development, or Western modernization, can and should be replicated worldwide. Ultimately, they saw Western development as a sign of both moral and social superiority. In this view, progress is linear, and it was based on ideas of social Darwinism that have largely been considered outmoded today. While they had the laudable goal of improving the human condition, they had very problematic assumptions about how to go about doing this. Most developmentalist theories tended to blame the victim or the poorer nation for failure to develop. They looked for flaws in their culture, flaws in their economic base, flaws in the ways they were going about doing things. However, More modern theories began to consider that these nations were not trying to develop on their own, but within a context of international relations. Developmentalist thinking gave way to dependency and world systems theories. For world systems and dependency theorists, they see development and underdevelopment as related phenomenon. As they point out, developed nations rely heavily on underdeveloped nations for things like resources and labor. Dependency and world systems theorists highlight how exploitation is part of development and that rich nations become that way by exploiting or taking advantage of poorer and less powerful nations. These theories are linked most commonly to Marx and conflict theory. Wallerstein provides a classic example. Wallerstein points out that there's three assumptions that we can make about the evolution of the modern world. That most of the modern world has been in contact with modernizing Europe since about the 1500s. Since 1900, when the colonial empires broke up, economic control has continued to be maintained through inequitable trade relations. And that in the third case, there is a world trade system that ultimately acts as an international system of stratification. There is competition to control the system, and some nations are significantly advantaged over others. Today, theorists take a more global view. However, they do highlight sources of ongoing dependency in the current market. One example is the limited exportable products that many poorer or smaller nations are strongly encouraged to produce. Many nations are encouraged to become dependent on things like coffee. That's a luxury good. When the economy goes bad for us, we drink less coffee. There's also the problem of debt trap. Many poorer nations end up having to take out loans with interest rates they really can't afford. We saw many countries having the same problem that homeowners had recently here in our country. They took out variable interest rate loans, and then suddenly interest rates went up. They found themselves barely able to pay the interest, let alone the principal. Multinational corporations can be very problematic for poorer countries. While they may provide jobs in many cases, they often require that these countries entice them by creating some of the infrastructure for them. Then when they leave to find even cheaper labor, they've stuck this country with a bill and a lot of unemployed people. And finally, many of these nations then end up having what are called extroverted economies. They're dependent on exporting luxury goods or labor, and that makes you a very fundamentally weak economy. Many scholars today are also concerned about the problem of neo-colonialism. The way that many of the least industrialized nations are completely at the mercy of international markets. As I already mentioned, the impact of multinationals is also something that is being significantly considered. Many scholars highlight the environmental devastation that can follow when a poor country with few regulations plays host to factories. The race to the bottom refers to poor countries devaluing labor in an attempt to entice companies in. Ultimately, when you win the race to the bottom, what it means is your workers aren't really making enough money to survive. Finally, we have severe technological imbalances. Wealthy nations have such a head start in the production and use of technology that it will be difficult for any least industrialized nation to catch up. In fact, part of the exploitation of the poorest areas of the world is for minerals and labors needed to produce technology.